If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy.
Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum here at Woodford in Cheshire, and to our magnificent XM603 Vulcan B2, which was assembled here in 1963, and she returned in 1982.
Great stuff. And is the museum open just on weekends?
Generally speaking, but we do open on Tuesdays and Thursdays for private visits that have been arranged, usually schools, Rotary clubs, things like that.
Great stuff. So Trevor, when did you become interested in aviation?
I couldn't actually put a precise date on that, but I must have been about 8 years of age. But I didn't really get involved until I was about 10. And from the age of 10, all I wanted to do was fly.
What year did you actually join the RAF?
I actually joined the Royal Air Force in 1961.
And can you talk us through some of your basic flying training and what aircraft they were on?
Right, well, I'll just go back a little bit because at school I went to Hornchurch, which was the Aircrew selection centre in those days, for something called pre-assessment. When you were not old enough, you went through the Aircrew selection, and I was successful at that, and they said, fine, come back when you're old enough, which I did. Unfortunately, by then I had developed a medical issue, and they said, sorry, but you can't become aircrew at the moment. It will resolve itself in time, but not at the moment. But I wanted to join the Air Force, so I joined the Air Force, and I was actually on the very last National Service course that went through RAF Bridgnorth in 1961. I was in a section of the Royal Air Force that was unbelievably small. There were less than 10 of us doing this job, which was electromedical technical work. And I was working in London for Sir Aubrey Rumble, and he was the Queen's heart surgeon, and it was a heart issue that I had. And I realised that on my ECG the problem had resolved itself, and I went and saw him and asked him if he would be one of my supporters in trying to apply for aircrew again, which he very kindly did. And I went off down to Biggin Hill, and I then joined the, well, I was already in the Air Force, but I then transferred across to aircrew. And so that started basic training in 1964/65, and I first flew in 1965.
Wow. So what aircraft was it? The Bulldog at the time and stuff like
No. Interesting enough, I went to the flying training school at Acklington, which is in Northumberland, not very far from where you come from, which was great fun. And one flew the Jet Provost 3, and then the Jet Provost 4, if I'm right. And I did my very first solo at Euston, up the Tyne Valley there.
Very nice. So did you know what aircraft you wanted to go on to, like on the front line?
I hadn't a clue.
Oh, all right, you didn't have anything in mind?
Had not a clue.
Oh, okay.
I think I rather, if I think back, supported going on to larger aircraft, larger than this, simply because I had an affinity, not that I had anything to do with them, flying boats. So the flying boats had all gone out of service by then, but I think I knew that the Shackleton was was in service. I possibly had an inkling about Shackletons, but nothing more than that.
Yeah, it's very strange because some people had a mindset on one aircraft, and other people I just wanted to fly. They weren't bothered, and you seem to be one of them people. You just maybe wanted to fly, I guess.
Indeed, and as you will uncover from me, I've flown quite a variety of aeroplanes during my career.
So Trevor, when did you find out you were going to go to Vulcans?
Well, after flying training, I went to Valley and I was flying the Nat there. And halfway through the course, one was called in by the flight commander and he asked whether I had any ideas about flying the Vulcan, which I didn't at the time. However, I thought, well, why not? And so that was very convenient for them because that was another tick on the box. And so when I finished at Finningley, I went off to, at Valley, I went off to Finningley. But very interestingly, most of my compatriots at Valley went off to Chivenor to fly the Hunter. And indeed, when they all met up at Chivenor, my name was called out as being one of the, where's Jackson? Well, no idea. So they discovered I was at Finningley and I was on another course, another aircraft, and the rest is history, as they say.
There you go. So can you tell us what the actual role of the Vulcan was in the time you joined the force?
Right. It was the Vulcan Mark II, and it was the country's, or one of the strategic medium bombers. It had a nuclear role, and the squadron that I went to, we also had a conventional role. Scampton, they were very dedicated to the standoff blue steel system, which was completely different, but I went to conventional free fall squadron at Waddington.
And can you talk us through some of your ground training? I mean, that must have been quite intense for such a large aircraft and all the systems.
Yes. It all started off, we would mingle and we would meet up and form a crew. Because Vulcan had a crew of 5, 2 pilots, 2 navigators, one looking after the radar, one looking after the actual navigation, and an air electronics officer. So we all met up as a crew, and then we started our ground training. The pilots' union would do the pilots' union bits, and SODCAT would do their bits, but we would all come together. If you're looking puzzled, SODCAT, yeah. Society of Directional Consultants and Allied Trades.
Right.
Okay. And we would join up and do some of the ground training together. Of course, things like dinghy drills, safety drills, all that was crew training. And you'd go into the swimming baths and jump into a dinghy and, have a little splash around for a bit. And then it would be the flying training. You asked about a simulator. I don't think there was a simulator, but we would certainly have had a procedures trainer where we would sit in and go through all the checklists. And then you'd start the flying training.
Did you have to go through like security because it was nuclear capable, but if you were just free fall bombs, did you have to? Was that not part of your course?
We all had to be positively vetted by the security services. But once the Navy took over the nuclear role, which was in July 1969, PV sort of dropped off the radar, I think, from that moment on.
So let's talk a bit about your flying training. What would it be? What would it involve? And where would you fly?
Well, we were all flying out of Finningley, and you would, just like any aeroplane, you would learn how to fly, how to turn it, the usual exercises, what to do if engine failed, procedures like that, and circuit bashing.
And was it, I mean, working with the crew, did that take some time getting used to?
No, it was quite enjoyable. Okay. I remember the very first flight that we did together as our first solo. I mean, wow. We say first solo. There were 5 of us in there, of course, but it was the crew. Yeah. And we were going through our pre-start checks, and the radar switched on the BBC radio. So we had the BBC music being played through. And at that time, I'll never forget it, Shelley Man Singers, Up, Up and Away.
No way.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I mean that became a theme song for me for the rest of my life.
Brilliant stuff. So during training, did you get to drop any live weapons or any weapons at all?
No, not during training. Once you got to the squadron, that was a whole different ball game. Then things started to happen, and yes, we would drop 28-pound practice bombs. Eventually, you get up to the big 1,000-pounders, but there were not many ranges that could accept those. We went out to El Adam, which was in Libya. You could go there at that time. That was in the desert, of course, and it was the one and only time we actually dropped 21 1,000-pound bombs. That was in the July of '69, and Colonel Gaddafi took over in the August. So that was the end of bombing in Libya.
Wow. So we have to talk about how the aircraft handled and what were its strengths and weaknesses.
Well, very interestingly, Avro were asked to build a two-seat one-third scale aircraft, the Avro 707C, which we've actually got here at the museum. We took delivery of it from Cosford in November, and we'll be putting it on display as soon as we possibly can. And that was built specifically for pilot training. But the aircraft was so docile, if I can use that word, it was elected not to use that, and people just went straight into the aircraft and flew it straight off. Of course, you can't see anything of the aircraft, so you couldn't see the wings at all. So you had this interesting panel in the centre of the instrument, central panel, so that you could see the position of your flying controls. It was a lovely aeroplane to fly, though it did have its foibles because of its shape, and the company had to produce systems that got over the problems. Pitch dampers to get rid of the pitch issue, automark trim to get over the longitudinal instability, and yaw dampers to stop the Dutch rolling. But of course, when you turn those off, these problems came back, so we had limitations in our speeds.
I heard it was really good up high, yeah, even against like something like a Lightning that could outturn like the fighters at the time. Is there any truth to that?
Well, absolutely. Well, when the aircraft was first designed in...
Number 2, please, for the Vulcan cockpit visit.
Sorry about that. When the aircraft was first designed in 46, 47, it was envisaged it was going to fly so high and so fast, no enemy aircraft could get near it. So there was no need for any defensive capability at all. But by the early 1950s, aircraft were going through the sound barrier, no problem at all.
Yeah.
And even here at Avros, they were building an experimental aircraft that could fly at 65,000 feet, doing Mach 2.5. So they realised that the Vulcan was going to be unbelievably vulnerable. But the aerodynamicists got together and they said, if we can come up with this new wing, what they wanted to do was increase the wingspan from 99 feet to 111 feet, put a double kink on the leading edge, give it a droop leading edge, also change the power setting from 110 volts DC to 200 volts AC, change the flying controls at the back from ailerons and elevators into elevons, so they all operated as ailerons and elevators in the ratio of 5 to 4. And of course they had a more powerful engine. Initially it was 17,000 pounds of thrust each engine, and then for the Skybolt aircraft it was going to go up to 21,000 pounds of thrust. That was a lot of grunt, and at high level we could outturn any fighters. They would just fall out of the sky. But of course, development of weapon systems and aircraft meant eventually that fighters didn't have to come in and get into combat. They could just stand off and fire their missiles from vast range, and we had to have our electronic countermeasures in order to try and cloak where we were.
I always wondered why they didn't put reheat on the Vulcan. Would it just not have worked, or was it just not necessary?
It was not necessary at that time. However, if Skybolt had worked and it had come into service, there was going to be a Mark III Vulcan built, which would have carried 4 of these Skybolts, and it would have had an increased wingspan, 124 feet, I think it was. They would have had increased power Olympus engines. Initially, the engine that would have gone into TSR2, and that would have had reheat. That would have been one enormous great aircraft. But Skybolt didn't work, it was cancelled, and that was just consigned to history.
What plane that would have been?
Yeah, that would have, I mean, at air displays, it would have made a real impact.
Absolutely. Trevor, what was the Vulcan cockpit like? Was it comfortable?
It was compact. It was certainly not built for comfort. It was very cramped in the front, but I mean, it was cramped in the back for the 3 guys who were facing rearwards in that dark black hole. So at least we could see out a bit, but it was very restricted visibility, which wasn't an issue most of the time, but it could be an issue in the landing configuration.
Was there wiggle room to get up and stretch your legs or anything like that, or once you're in your seat, that's it?
Generally speaking, once you're in your seat, you're in your seat. However, on the Falklands campaign, of course, they had to swap seats over, and in order to do that, they had to put the pins back into the ejection seat and then swap over and then make the seat live again.
Yeah, and I've been in the cockpit and it's pretty cramped, but a bit of a scary place almost.
Yeah, and when we went overseas, we would carry a crew chief with us as well. So there would be the 5 of us plus the crew chief, sometimes 2 crew chiefs. So it was, yeah, it was a, shall we say, uncomfortable.
So what was your first squadron?
I joined 101 Squadron at Waddington. We were the first Mark II squadron to join the squadron. They were re-equipping with Mark IIs because they still had the Mark, I say the Mark I, it was the 1A. They were the last Vulcan squadron to get rid of the 1As, and that was in 1967.
Did you sit QA in your time? QRA?
Yes, once we had built ourselves up to be what they call combat ready, we would go on to QRA. And you would be on QRA for 24 or 48 hours, and you were on 15 minutes readiness to go to war.
15 minutes? Wow.
Yeah, we had a bomber box which would beep every 30 seconds to let us know that it was working. And the bomber controller would bring us to readiness state 05 or 02. 05, we would go out to the aircraft in the crew bus, which we drove ourselves, get in the aircraft, and well, this is at Waddington anyway, we would start engines, and then we would be reverted back to readiness state 15. Or we could go immediately to 02. Now that was when it became very interesting, because we had a button on the start panel which said rapid. You press that and all 4 engines started together, and the 02 referred to the fact that we could be on the runway and airborne inside 2 minutes. We then had to have the daily secret codes to know whether we were actually going to get airborne or if we were going to go back for a cup of tea and a biscuit.
That's crazy to think about. It's madness. Was the jet capable of air-to-air refuelling in your time?
Yes. However, we never practiced it.
No.
Because it was deemed unnecessary. And indeed, subsequently, the air-to-air refuelling probes were removed from the aircraft. And of course, the Falklands campaign, that was in 1982, the aircraft didn't have refueling probes. Nobody had actually practiced refueling, and they needed all this stuff to be reinstated. So in a very brief period of time, the aircraft were re-equipped. There was, if you read the books, 607, it's a very interesting story of how they managed to get it all back up and running. But of course the crews didn't have time to do any practice. And so for the Falklands campaign, they introduced Victor tanker instructors into the right-hand seat to actually do the refueling on their way down to the Falklands and on the way back.
So did you ever fly on any large exercises?
We were exercising all the time. Generally speaking, they would be generation exercises, and we would go to our dispersal airfields around the country and then fly off, do simulated attacks, and then back to base, and that would be it. Mm-hmm. Large-scale NATO exercises, I don't think I was actually involved in any of those. A lot of those happened subsequently. We would go out to Australia and get involved with the Australians, or we would go out to America and get involved with the Americans. It was not until subsequent flying different types of aircraft that I got involved in the large-scale NATO exercises.
Mm. And when you said you went over to America, did you ever talk to the B-52 crews and maybe swap notes or anything like that?
Well, they used to call us the four-engined fighter. That, compared with the B-52,
yeah.
we were rather impressive, and it was great fun going over to the States and doing an air display inside the boundaries of an airfield, whereas the B-52 would be a fly past and then several hours later return.
Very true. So how do you think other nations viewed the Vulcan?
We never really got into that. We went out and operated with the Australians, and they were very impressed with it, because we were doing air defence exercises with them, and it was the only form of air defence exercise that they got apart from when they were playing amongst themselves. Mm. So.
Yeah, because I heard a few stories, interviewed a few Buccaneer guys, and when they went to Red Flag, the Americans didn't even know what the Buccaneer was. They were just like, what is that thing? It looks really old. And I was just thinking maybe the Americans view the Vulcan maybe in that way, or...
The Americans are really quite insular. They don't see anything beyond their boundaries, I think. That's the answer. But yes, we held our own. And indeed, we were, on the Vulcan, they were involved in the bombing competitions, the giant voice competitions, and indeed, once the squadrons realised the way to win a competition, the Vulcans certainly went and wiped the board.
Brilliant, that's great. So you probably have many, but can you share maybe a few memorable stories from your time flying the Vulcan?
Ooh, let's see. One interesting was when we were flying back from Australia back up to Butterworth in Malaysia. The tropopause over the UK is about 6 miles high. Mm. Out in the tropics, it's 11 miles high. So you can go rather high in the Vulcan. And on this particular occasion, we were coming back from Darwin up to Butterworth, and we thought, well, let's just see how high we can go. So we got rather high, and we had a Scottish air electronics officer who happened to have his bagpipes with him. And he decided that he would like to claim the world altitude record for bagpipe playing. So we hear this screeching sound from the back. I happen to have a didgeridoo, and I say, well, let's claim the world record for didgeridoo playing. And so we had a little go, and that was it. And then we thought, well, if we do write to the Guinness Book of Records and tell them actually how high we've been, the Royal Air Force won't be very impressed when they discover how high we have been, and we won't have much of a career in the Air Force. So we decided to remain quiet about that, but just unofficially claim the world altitude record.
You know in yourself you did it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, you see, we were all wearing partial pressure breathing jerkins, and we had the Taylor helmets on as well. So.
Oh, the Taylor! Wow, is that the one that looks like almost like a space?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
In the early 1960s, the Air Force did actually do some experiments with almost a spacesuit, but they realised that they didn't actually need to go that high, or whatever, and abandoned the idea. But some of the kit, of course, still remained on.
So, how many hours did you get, and did you enjoy your time on the Vulcan?
The years that I was on it, I must have accumulated about 1,200 hours.
Wow.
Excuse me. It was Yeah, it had its moments, but there were lots of periods when one was doing other things, simulator training, target study. So at Waddington we had centralised servicing, which meant that when you went out to fly, you didn't particularly know which aircraft you were going to get. So interesting enough, there were 88 of the Mark IIs that flew of the 89 that were built, because they used one for fatigue testing here at Woodford. I looked through my logbook and I've actually flown 54 of them, including the 2 that we've got here.
That's impressive.
So,
and before we wrap up the Vulcan part, in your time flying, was there any upgrades, or was it the same from start to finish on your time?
well, during the 60s, of course, being the strategic bomber, it had cash thrown at it, really.
Right.
So there were upgrades all the time. But once the Navy took over the deterrent capability, money dried up. And so there were very few modifications that came in. And by the late 1970s, the aircraft had become so long in the tooth, it was pretty vulnerable. But it soldiered on, of course, until 1982, when they were all being taken out of service, and then the Falklands kicked off, and suddenly, in its twilight, it was involved in what was then the world's longest conventional range bombing raid in the world.